Japan is one of the most urbanized nations on Earth. The Greater Tokyo area alone packs in 37 million people, the largest metropolitan region in the world. Follow the Pacific coast and you'll find an almost unbroken chain of vast cities, including Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, and Hiroshima. Around 80 million people live on this narrow strip. But cross the central mountains to the other side of Honshu, Japan's largest island, and the picture changes. The regions alongside the Sea of Japan are noticeably quieter. Niigata, Kanazawa, Toyama, scattered cities, far smaller, separated by longer stretches of countryside. It's one of the starkest contrasts in the developed world. Two coasts, same country, completely different realities. So, why did Japan focus development so heavily on one side compared to the other? The first clue lies in Japan's spine. The Japanese Alps run down the center of Honshu, splitting the islands into two fundamentally different worlds. On the Pacific side, geography handed Japan a gift. The Kantō Plain, surrounding Tokyo, stretches across thousands of square kilometers. Flat, fertile land, perfect for agriculture and urban expansion. The Kansai region around Osaka offers the same advantages: wide river deltas, natural harbours, and a gentle topography, which welcome development. These plans provided the agricultural supply that's needed to feed cities and the flat ground that makes construction both practical and affordable. Cross the mountains to the western coast and the landscape transforms completely. The Japanese Alps plunge almost directly into the sea in places. Coastal plains exist, but they're narrower, squeezed between towering peaks and crashing waves. Where Tokyo sprawls across thousands of square kilometers, West Coast cities are hemmed in by geography from every direction. The numbers tell a story. The Pacific coast of Honshu contains around 65% of Japan's population on less than 40% of the country's land, compared to 12% of people on the west side of the island. Geography dictated where Japanese cities were built and how much they could grow, but limiting space was only the beginning. Trade routes also played a role in the growth and locations of Japan's cities. Early Japanese seafaring traders built strong links with China and Korea. However, trade coming across the East China Sea and the Sea of Japan tended to hone in on southern entry points into Kyushu Island and the Seto Inland Sea. With a wealth of natural harbours and calmer sheltered bays, the north and west coast was isolated in comparison, facing harsh winters, trickier sea conditions, and mountains making up much of the island. This shifted internal development toward the Pacific Plains and south, where trade was burgeoning, and the land and climate was kinder. By the Edo period, domestic trade networks had established the Pacific side as Japan's economic center. Edo, a small fishing town which became the future Tokyo, grew as the political center and eastern terminus for goods. Osaka dominated as the commercial capital, where merchants gathered to trade rice, textiles, and crafts. Pacific and southern ports attracted more trade, which attracted more merchants, which attracted more people. This created a feedback loop that would shape Japan for centuries, but then the country's trajectory changed. In 1639, something dramatic happened, which would change the country for more than 2 centuries. The leader of the military government, Tokugawa Ieyasu, enforced a long period of isolationism. The more than 200-year spell was called the Sakoku period. The ambition was to try and prevent colonial powers from gaining a hold in Japan, as they had elsewhere. The government banned Christianity, restricted foreign trade enormously, and tried to stamp out foreign influence throughout all areas of Japanese life. Japanese citizens were barred from traveling abroad, and a minimal number of international traders would be allowed to dock in the country's ports. However, domestic trade routes then flourished, with the Pacific and southern hubs expanding in size. Where traders once might have looked to foreign shores, they turned to look at each other, and inter-Japanese trade routes blossomed. When the end of the Sakoku period came in 1853, Japan began an era of rapid modernization. During the Meiji era in the late 19th century, The new government built industrial infrastructure around existing Pacific economic hubs, an exponential growth that has continued to the modern day. But geography and trade routes weren't the only forces at work. There was another factor that made the West Coast challenging for dense settlement in comparison to the East. Every winter, the Japanese regions, alongside the Sea of Japan, face some of the heaviest snowfall on Earth. This isn't a gentle dusting, we're talking an enormous amount of snow, which hammers its towns, cities, and mountainous areas, causing regular disruption for transportation, trade, and daily life. The cause is straightforward. Icy Siberian winds blow out across the relatively warm Sea of Japan, gathering moisture before hitting the mountains in the country's west and peppering its cities with large dumps of snow. Niigata regularly receives around 3 meters of snow annually, considerably more than Bergen in Norway. Meanwhile, some higher mountain areas record snowfalls of up to 10 meters every year. Compare this to Tokyo, which receives less than 10 centimeters of snow per year on average. The Pacific coast enjoys what the Japanese call clear winter skies, cold but dry, with sunshine that makes winter bearable. The Sea of Japan coast endures months of grey, overcast skies, constant snowfall, and bitterly cold winds. The seasonal isolation historically made dense settlement and commerce nearly impossible. Sea of Japan communities developed smaller, more self-sufficient settlements that could survive months of climate hardship. These adaptations allowed survival, but they didn't encourage vast urban growth, which has characterized the Pacific coast. This natural barrier became even more pronounced when Japan entered the modern industrial age. When Japan embarked on rapid modernization in the late 19th century, it built on existing foundations, all of which favored the Pacific side of the country. The Meiji government's industrial strategy concentrated expansion around the existing urban centers and connected them with modern transportation. Tokyo became the political and financial capital. Yokohama grew as the primary international port. Nagoya emerged as a manufacturing hub. Osaka remained the key commercial center. All Pacific-sided cities. The new rail network reinforced this pattern. The Tokaido Main Line, completed in 1889, connected Tokyo to Kobe and Osaka, becoming the spine of Japan's transportation system. High-speed rail arrived on the route in the 1960s. Progress on the Sea of Japan coastline was much slower, with high-speed rail only beginning in the late 1980s, and sections were still being completed in 2024. This infrastructure gap had profound consequences. When foreign companies wanted to establish operations in Japan, they naturally gravitated toward Pacific ports with good connections. When Japanese companies needed to export products, they used Pacific shipping routes. The result was a concentration of industrial investment that made the Pacific coast even more dominant. The belt of land from Tokyo to Fukuoka now contains around 70% of Japan's manufacturing capacity. The entire Sea of Japan coast accounts for only 15%. Japan's largest corporations cluster overwhelmingly in Pacific cities. Sony, Toyota, Honda, Panasonic, all based on the Pacific side. But industrialization was just one factor cementing the Pacific coast's dominance. The mountains created a physical barrier that would prove nearly impossible to overcome, even with modern technology. The Japanese Alps don't just divide Japan geographically, they divide it economically, culturally, and politically. Before modern transportation, crossing these mountains was dangerous and time-consuming. The few mountain passes were often blocked by snow in winter, cutting off the Sea of Japan communities from the rest of the country for months. Cities grew through connection to markets, suppliers, ideas, and people. When that connection is severed by geography, growth stagnates. Even after the Meiji government began building railways through the mountains, the engineering challenges were enormous. Tunnels had to be blasted through solid rock, bridges had to span deep gorges, coasts were many times higher than building on flat coastal plains. Because cities across the Sea of Japan were small, they couldn't justify expensive transportation infrastructure. Because they lacked good connections, they couldn't grow large enough to justify the investment. Even today, with modern tunnels and bullet trains, the population density gap remains stark. Travel from Tokyo to Osaka, and you'll pass through continuous urban development. Travel the same distance along the Sea of Japan coast, and you'll pass through mostly rural landscapes, punctuated by much smaller cities. Today, Japan displays one of the most extreme examples of uneven development in the developed world. The urban corridor stretching from Tokyo to Nagoya and on to Osaka and Fukuoka contains around 80 million people, nearly 2/3 of Japan's entire population, living on a narrow strip along eastern and southern coasts. The largest west coast city has fewer people than many Tokyo suburbs. This pattern has only become more pronounced as Japan's population ages and declines. Rural communities and smaller cities on the west have been particularly badly hit, with some areas seeing their population fall by more than 20% since 1990. Meanwhile, Tokyo continues to grow. In response to this imbalance, the Japanese government has launched regional revitalization programs, including subsidies for rural relocation, high-speed rail extensions to Sea of Japan cities, and the promotion of remote work. The projects to stem the brain drain have had some success, particularly in tourism hotspots like Kanazawa. However, the urban pull to Pacific cities remains strong. The aging population is a big concern in the country, with it projected to drop below 100 million people by 2025. It's currently 123 million. But this dramatic imbalance doesn't mean the Sea of Japan coast disappeared entirely. Instead, it found a different path, one that worked with its geographic constraints rather than against them. Cut off from the main currents of Japanese development, Sea of Japan communities developed economic strategies based on their unique advantages. Some agriculture thrived in the region's rich soil and abundant water. Nagita became famous for producing some of Japan's highest quality rice. Fishing became a major source of business too, with large fishing fleets leaving ports along the west coast and seafood processing plants collecting in its towns and cities. Meanwhile, the Hokuriku region became a leader in silk production and other textile industries. Energy production has become another specialization, with the region's abundant water, natural resources, and sparse populations proving ideal for hydroelectric and nuclear power. More recently, tourism has blossomed. The same heavy snowfall and mountainous terrain that historically isolated the region now attracts millions in winter sport enthusiasts for some of the best skiing in Asia. In the summer, it draws hikers. These industries employ thousands and generate billions in revenue, but the region's geography still dictates the size of development that is possible and leads to constraints. Japan's lopsided development becomes even more pronounced when viewed in a global context. The Pacific coast faces the world's largest ocean and contains the vast majority of Japan's major export hubs and deep-water ports, connecting the country to its most important trading partners: China, the United States, South Korea, Southeast Asian nations, and Australia. Tokyo's airports handle more than 120 million passengers annually. Yokohama and Tokyo Bay ports process millions of containers each year. The Sea of Japan coast faces a much smaller body of water, with more limited international connections with China, Russia, and South Korea, primarily trading steel, machinery, and chemicals. This geographic orientation has become more important as Japan's economy has globalized. Companies need easy access to international markets, suppliers, and talent. The Pacific coast provides that access. The Sea of Japan coast doesn't. Despite its natural beauty and its cultural richness, the Sea of Japan side of the country remains peripheral to these global networks, which raises the question: was this divide inevitable, or could Japan have developed differently? In the end, geography determined Japan's development pattern. The mountains were always going to divide the island and make developing large cities challenging on its rugged western terrain. The winter storms were always going to bury the west coast in snow and make trade more challenging. The flatter and milder east coast was always going to benefit from better conditions for agriculture and have better terrain for urban development. These eastern cities would grow more quickly and prosper thanks to natural harbours and sheltered bays, as people on the west coast battled the climate and the topography. On the Pacific side today, you have megacities that never sleep, bullet trains that run with clockwork precision, global corporations that shape the world economy, a landscape which is one of the most densely populated regions on Earth. On the Sea of Japan side, you have traditional towns intersected with much smaller cities, large expanses of beautiful nature untouched by the kind of development seen in the East. A landscape where silence and space remain, on which now draws many tourists who escape the urban centers found elsewhere in Japan. It's a relationship as old as Japan itself. The mountains that divide also unite, creating not one Japan, but two complementary halves of a greater whole. The question was never why Japan doesn't build cities on its west coast. The question is, given the constraints of geography, climate, and trade patterns, how could it have ever done anything else?